Hi, I'm Nick Lemann. I'm a professor at Columbia Journalism School, and I'm here to talk to you about our Masters of Arts program. I'm here with my colleague, Professor Winnie O'Kelley. So let me give you a little background, because our school, although it's a small and intimate place, has a number of different programs. So I want to talk about what the MA program is. Columbia Journalism School opened in 1912. When it started, it was an undergraduate school, and then in the early 1930s it became a graduate school and started to offer a one-year Master of Science program. It's still our largest degree program. That program historically has concentrated on the skills you need to be a working journalist. We're a professional school that sends people out of here into newsrooms. So the MS program assumes, although this isn't true of a lot of our students, that you have done no journalism, and takes it from the beginning and teaches you how to write a story on deadline and a lot of other things. We started the MA program a little over 10 years ago with a couple of goals in mind. First of all, the MS program is more focused on skills associated with actually producing journalism. The MA program is more focused on understanding as a journalist complicated subjects you might be asked to cover. So although the MA students do a huge amount of journalism through their year here, what they're doing in the classroom is more focused on understanding the topic in a deep way, and less on production techniques and formats. So that's one. Second, the MA program, as it's developed, has become, I guess I would call it a program for late, early career journalists. That is, almost everybody in the program is already a journalist, and they're not applying to the Master of Science program because they already have that level of skills, but they feel often stuck in their career. They want to go to a new place. They want to add to their skill set, and they're kind of stopped on the point of a richer, more sophisticated understanding of what they're covering. That's where we come in, and the MA students come to us for a year, and at the end of that year they go on and return to being journalists in almost all cases, doing different, richer, often higher level work. Because of the focus of the MA program, the MS program, traditionally the sort of categorical divisions were things like television, radio, magazines, newspapers. There's a little less of that now online. In the MA program, we have 4 big categories, and they're not delivery system categories, they're subject categories. And they are politics, which is the one I teach in, business and economics, which is the one Winnie teaches in, arts and culture, and science. So when you apply to the program, you apply into one of those 4 concentrations specifically, and you have a very intense experience with a fairly small cohort of people in your subject matter major with your professor or professors. That's the overview. Let me ask Winnie to talk about what happens in the business major, and then I'll come back and talk about what happens in the politics major.
Okay, thanks, Nick. You know, this is my first year doing this, and I'm excited to be here. I find an extraordinary group of students from around the world. There's a lot of energy and excitement. And when I try to say why you would want to do this, I'm a long-term business and economics journalist myself, and I'm really passionate about this. I believe if you want to do the kind of work that is begging to be done in this day and age, you have to have some expertise. Whether you're trying to figure out what shell companies are doing and how money is being laundered out of Malaysia or out of some other country or by some other regime, or even in our own country where money can be deployed in mysterious ways, you've got to have a deep skeletal understanding, at least, of economy and business and how it works. So in the fall, we spend a decent amount of time, and it's been an exciting time to be doing that this year. You know, we talk about the surge of crony capitalism around the world, and also in our own country, where we see a lot of transactional transactional business going on in Washington. And so during this exciting time, we try to help people understand sort of the big concepts we're wrestling with, whether it be inequality, whether it can be economic cycles, government policies that will decide whether they run huge deficits. Countries like Italy and France are right now wrestling with these very big decisions over, do they run big deficits in order to help their people have a better standard of living, and what are the risks to them of the longer term for that? And it's playing out on a global stage. So I think it's an exciting time to come in and get your hands on that. In the spring, we shift a little bit to a little bit more industry and company specific work, where you try to understand how you value companies and how you understand the decision making that's going on, and how industries can rise and fall and the disruptions of them. So it works well with what Nick does too in this political environment right now, but that's, I think, what you can get out of this program.
So in politics, well, let me go back a little bit and give some more of the history of the program. So this is year 1 for Winnie, year 16 for me. So I was part of the group that basically built the MA program from scratch and figured out what the 4 majors would be and roughed out what we'd teach in those majors and built a faculty and all that. At the time, in journalism education, you know, you'd often hear people say, well, journalism schools should just teach skills, not substance, because if you want to learn substance, you should go to some other part of the university and learn that. And we're doing this program partly because we don't agree with that traditional theory. The students in the MA program do take usually 3 one-semester courses in the course of the year outside the journalism school at another part of the university. However, the problem with having that kind of very strict division of skills and substance is that when you take the substance courses at another part of the university, you're writing term papers. You're not writing journalism as your assignment. So you have to kind of do the work in your head of how would I map what I'm learning substantively back onto the practice of journalism. In this program, we insource all that. So you're taught these substantive understanding by journalists in a journalism school, and all the assignments are works of journalism. The king of the assignments, I suppose, is the thesis project that every MA student does. So part of what we're teaching is substance, and part of what we're teaching is how to marry substance and journalistic practice. And it's very, very useful to be doing that in real time while you're a student, instead of having to kind of figure it out for yourself. So, as I mentioned, we have these 4 majors. So when we were devising the program, you know, in the science major, that was kind of an easy sell, because people, you know, everybody would say, if you're going to be a science journalist, you have to understand something about science, you have to understand how to read a scientific paper, and so on. Business and economics was the second easiest, although not universal. When we were starting, one of our prominent alums, who is a now retired, very prominent business journalist, called me and said, you know, the whole reason for my success in business journalism is that I don't understand anything about economics, and I don't know how to read a balance sheet. So some people you can't convince, but I think the world has kind of moved. It
definitely helps.
In our
Let's
direction,
not kid ourselves.
particularly after the financial crisis caught much of the financial press flat-footed. Arts and politics were harder. Most working political journalists, many at least, don't think they need to know anything about political science and related fields. But I think that's changing too. You know, we had in 2008, I mean, I'm sorry these things happened, but they were good proof of concept for the MA program. The global economy collapsed, and that led to a lot of thinking in journalism. You know, we have to understand this stuff.
Right.
In 2016, more or less, the global political system began to collapse, maybe. We had a big political surprise here in the United States, and we had large populist, nationalist kind of uprisings everywhere from, you know, India to Greece to Hungary to, as we're sitting here today, Britain and France. Yeah. And it really helped create a conversation around maybe it's not such a good idea to try to understand politics as a horse race. Maybe how political systems work and how political institutions work is actually more important. So when we built the MA Politics concentration, the initial keepers were Alexander Stila and Thomas Edsel, who's now shows up in the class quite a bit but is retired and writes a column for the New York Times. So now it's Professor Stila and myself. Somewhat like in the business concentration, right. The first semester is kind of master concepts, and the second semester is institutions. So the second semester, the first semester, which Professor Stila teaches, we go through big ideas like what is a state, and what is mobilization, and what is resource distribution, and so on. And in my semester this spring, we go through just the core building blocks of politics. Interest groups, political parties, legislatures, executives, regulatory agencies, and so on. This is a very international group. US students are always in a minority. And sometimes one year I had only one US student. This year there's more. Usually we have more students from India, at least in the politics concentration, than from the US. So we learn a lot from each other. I learn a lot from the students. And when I say political institutions, all the institutions I mentioned exist everywhere that has an organized national government. So it's not particularized to New York or the US. It's talking about how this all works. And we have a lot of guests. Some of the guests are political scientists. Some of the guests are journalists. And in every class meeting, at least I try to have one academic work that people read and one journalistic work on the same subject, you know, so that we can show how they're connected and how the academic knowledge, if you know where to find it and how to think that way, can enrich your journalistic practice.
So I'll just echo. Mine is sort of a mirror image of what you do, where you're taking apart in the fall, you know, sort of the bigger concepts. We're also taking apart the bigger concepts and then looking at journalistically how you write about it. How do you anticipate the next recession, if there's one coming? What are the signals you look for? What will it mean? And how are the decisions that are being made in things like fiscal policy and monetary policy, what will they mean long down the road, both in the US and abroad? And one of the things we have to grapple with in a big way, and I also have a large number of foreign students, about half and half in my section, is how we're a much more global economy now. And some of it is unprecedented. So it's going to be exciting to sort of watch how it evolves in coming years, where we see things like central banks unable to have the exact same kind of predictive responses that they had anticipated to their actions, and governments as well, whether it's on things like trade or immigration, how those decisions can ripple around the world, or something that's evolving very much as we speak about it. So trying to help the students see what economists are writing about it and business people are thinking about it, and how they can better shine a light on what will actually be coming and the impacts on consumers and businesses and governments and political systems even, and how to really kind of tackle those stories. It's one thing to cover a story as it's happening, a news event about a downturn in the economy or new data that shows unemployment is going up. It's another thing to sort of be able to say, oh, okay, I can go out here and talk about how people's lives are changing and do something that's not just some anecdotes, but show how it's going to add up to a bigger change for people down the road. So that's the exciting part of what we're doing here. Mm-hmm. And I see the students really learning a lot, as you say, from each other. Many of them have very different experiences, and that really enriches the class. And also, learning from what's going on right now. We also spend a decent amount of time reading original source material, whether it's economics or political journalism, but also then really pulling in, how you write about this, and you take very difficult stories and subjects and convert them into something that that resonates with people. In the era of fake news, if you really want to, I think, have authority and have a voice, you have to understand the topic. You can't just, as you say, you've got to have some substance there. You can't just tell you what people are saying. It's got to be more than that.
Mm-hmm. I would also say, our two topics are kissing cousins.
Very complimentary,
like
absolutely.
We in political reporting got a really big wake-up call in the 2008 financial crisis because, some of the political reporters at least had thought, the economy is one story and politics is another story, and it's all about who's going to win the election and what bill's going to pass and so on. And suddenly you saw the entire global economy melting down. It had to be saved by government. So government was really in the economic picture in a way that was very up close and personal, and to some extent it still is. As you looked into it, you saw that a lot of government policy decisions that we in the press, the political press, had not been paying attention to, kind of set the stage for this big economic meltdown. Since then, you've seen, as I mentioned before, all of these massive political reactions to the financial crisis. And that again shows how closely linked these two subjects are. So a topic like globalization, which most of my longtime colleagues as political reporters thought was a kind of boring, dry thing people talked about in seminars and panel discussions, is suddenly making every political system in the world blow up. So, the very volatile and sort of insurrectionary politics you're seeing all over the world really hinges on economic policy and cultural implications it has around, trade, immigration, the issues that President Trump won on. So it's shown us as political reporters that we have to pay a lot more attention to the economy than we used to do.
I'll just to echo that a little bit. When I was at the New York Times during the financial crisis, but before that, Joe Lelyveld, when he was editor there, executive editor, used to say he wanted everybody who was going abroad or into politics to at least have a short stint in business coverage, just to get that kind of grounding. Right. So I sort of hope everybody gets a little taste of that, and hope I can do that not just with my students, but with the other students. We've talked about
and let's just put in a quick plug
for all the others.
Joe Lelyveld is a Columbia Journalism School grad.
He is indeed.
Can't resist saying that.
That's wonderful. So do you want to talk about what we think are some of the couple of the biggest issues that we're going to be grappling with?
Yeah, I want to say one other thing, it's sort of clear already, but just to make it clear, we and our other faculty members at the school, we teach and we're working journalists. We do somewhat different things in journalism, but we're both super active in the field, and that has a very deep effect on the way we teach, the kind of connections we hope to be able to make for our students, and so on.
Yeah, it creates a very dynamic atmosphere for sure. Just being in New York is part of that, but it's also the faculty as well. Yeah.
So on the issues that connect us, I don't know where to begin. We're in a moment now where we just had in the U.S. the 2016 midterm elections, in a very healthy economy. And that meant maybe that the traditional swing in a midterm election against the party of the incumbent president was somewhat less than it was in a year like 1994 or 2010. And certainly President Trump talked about that a lot. Now, the markets are, you have this kind of split. The markets have a fever, shall we say.
Yeah.
And the unemployment rate is low. How long is that going to last?
Oh, well, that's an interesting question. You're right. It's a real paradox, right? Right now, the economy is actually quite strong. The data coming out, which we always lean on for real facts, show a very robust economy. Growth, unemployment low, in levels we've not seen in many decades. But markets are different, right? Financial markets anticipate what's coming. They look at risk, and they're seeing some concerns. Now, whether they will prove right or not, we don't know. But all of those things on the horizon that we're talking about now, some of the trade conflict that could lead to really much worse trade conditions around the world are of great concern. Brexit. Theresa May, she survived, but we're not really sure what's going to happen to the European Union next year, and whether even Britain could have like a hard crash out of the European Union, which would have some really big drags onto that part of the economy. And because we're all trading partners, and the UK is such a large trading partner with us and many others, would also be a drag on economies here. So those are the kind of things we're looking at and waiting to see how it's going to play out. In the U.S., aside from the policies we're undertaking abroad, one of the things we've talked about is the deficit. We are spending so much more and taxing so much less at a boom time, which is not traditional economics of how you do things. Typically, during harsh times, during these great recessions, that's when you spend more than you're bringing in order to provide a cushion for people who need it in the population. And in this case, we're undertaking a different experiment under the Trump administration, where we have cut taxes and we're still spending in large quantities, including for the Pentagon. There's a lot of discussion right now about how much of the budget's going to increase for the Pentagon, and it's quite a lot. So that is going to put the U.S. in a very different position going forward, and that is some of the worry that the markets are thinking about. Will we have a debt load that becomes more unbearable and crowds out other kinds of spending in the U.S.? And that would, of course, be a drag on jobs and the economy. So I can't answer that, as you know, but that is certainly the worry that is sitting out there to the side.
Another political economic question that we should talk about is inequality, which, I mean, to be a little more technical about it, around 1980, you started to see productivity would go up, but the economic return to increased productivity wasn't equally distributed across the whole population as it used to be more. And the benefits were being harvested very disproportionately by the people at the top. And that is a big driver of our current politics, at least I think.
I agree.
Also, what you've seen in the Trump era is some really stark divergences between rural and urban, and between non-college educated and college educated. So you have just basically 85% of the counties in the United States voted for President Trump, which is, they're not the most populated counties, obviously, but that kind of split is unprecedented in American politics. The very heavy vote that he gets among non-college educated is unprecedented for a Republican. What's driving all that, and is there any way to stop this inequality cycle that seems to determine the country's political mood and economic mood so much?
You know, that's a something that we have to really give a lot of thought to. I mean, one of the things that comes up repeatedly is, should some people be making so much money? And that is one of the reasons inequality has really taken off, is because some people at the top, especially in finance, but also in tech and those kinds of fields, the gains for their successes have become so outsized in the capital markets. And the people at the bottom are not getting as much of a lift. But in fact, the people in the middle are the ones who are stagnant, and that's sort of the dissatisfied that you're talking about out in those rural counties
That's
and in much of
why
America.
hearing "Make America Great Again" resonates with you.
That's right, that's right. So there are some things that could be done about that, obviously. We could change our tax system ever so slightly even. Just some tweaks would make a difference. And that could happen. I don't see, as you don't, any move for that at the moment. So I don't really see a lot of that happening. There are other ways we could be addressing this, and some of them may be forced upon us as a nation. In other words, as we try to reckon with the fact that we have this large deficit and we're going to have to either spend a little less or tax a little bit more, there may start to be a bit of a shift. I'm not sure, obviously, where things are headed. I think inequality is not just a persistent issue in the U.S., but it is around the world. We happen to have a disproportionate number of those people earning the huge incomes, and our system is not set up as it currently is to really address that.
You know, if you say to most economists, what should we do about inequality, they'll say tax system. If you look at American political history, there's a long, long history of, you know, tariffs, antitrust law, breaking up big companies, et cetera. You know, what you might call in economics micro, not macro interventions. And, you know, for a season, the last quarter of the 20th century, there was a real consensus around, you know, markets and macroeconomics. And what a lot of those old 19th century, early 20th century remedies seem to be back on the table now politically. They're being talked about.
There's a fresh discussion for
Yeah.
sure. I'm not
They're
sure
not
there's
being
momentum,
talked about
but
in
yeah.
economics departments, but
No.
they're being talked about in politics. And it's going to be really interesting to see how that all plays out.
I think from the regulatory front in particular, in Washington going forward, even if Europe is the one that ultimately takes the lead, which it may or may not, the discussion about some of the largest companies and the amount of power they exert over individual lives and over the economy, so over other businesses, as they are able to branch out into so many different sectors and industries. And these, I'm primarily talking about the tech companies for the moment because that's what the most discussion is about these days, from Amazon and Google and others. Is there something that is too much or too big? That's what people are starting to wrestle with, and there's a quiet discussion about it. I think if we were to have a big change in Washington, if Democrats were to be back in control, there would probably be a shift to that. So that's something I think we can anticipate in a couple of years.
Yeah, and the politics is very upside down, at least in the U.S., and much of the rest of the world, in the sense that hating on tech companies is a Republican thing more than a Democratic thing, partly because the tech companies are considered to be sort of part of the Democratic Party. That's who their executives give to, et cetera. So, you know, in the last election cycle, you'd often hear Republican candidates saying, we're going after the big companies, which is new, but if it's tech companies.
Right.
Conversely, you know, going back to what I was saying before, you know, you went back 50 years, nobody with a college degree was voting Republican, almost nobody. Right. And now that's the Republican base. So there's a lot of things in play here that can turn out very unpredictably. And it's fun to, you know, have this occasion to think about them.
It is, and what we're seeing, at least in the tech companies, if we stick with that example for just a moment, although it's far from the only one, the U.S. laws that were written to address things like too much corporate power that go back to the days of Standard Oil really didn't anticipate the kind of environment we have now. So that's why it's harder to imagine anything changing without a congressional lawmaking effort to really go after it. Now, there are things that could change, but most likely that's probably what it would take. Other countries and other parts of the world have different sorts of rules around it, and they might be the ones to actually take the lead. And I think that may wind up
I agree.
surprising Americans. And so it's one of the reasons that like understanding sort of the global dynamics is so important at this point in time. Other countries and other regions may say, Google, we're not really comfortable, not just with privacy issues, but also with power, also with what you're able to wield here. Same thing for Amazon. And that may determine more of the inequality of those leaders down the road than anything the U.S. does in quite ironic fashion.
Right. I want to say, it's your first year, so you haven't really had this happen to you yet, but one of the great pleasures of teaching here is watching our graduates and seeing all the wonderful things they do in journalism, often very quickly after they leave here. In our cohort from MA Politics last year, one of my students, have a group of 15 or 16 students, so we get to know each other very well. One of them just published her thesis project in a shortened version in the New Yorker. One of them just got named as the chief U.S. correspondent for the leading daily newspaper in Finland. One of them is covering the U.S. and U.S. politics for one of the great news organizations in Australia. A lot of them are doing really interesting and wonderful things all over the world, and this happens quickly.
Yeah.
When I was young, you'd get out of school and you'd climb the ladder very, very slowly. You'd start in a suburban, covering school board meetings, and decades later. But now, one of the advantages for our students of the disruptions in journalism is they can get out there, with some luck and hard work and talent, and be doing really exciting global journalism really quickly after they leave.
I think that speaks to your vision for this program, which was you need a certain level of expertise. That's one of the ways you can distinguish yourselves.
Right.
It's very hard to be a generalist and be the expert tomorrow and do something definitive. It's much better, especially when you're starting out, if you can say, look, I understand something about this subject. I can go deeper on this, and I can bring you things that maybe other people can't.
Right.
And I think that is one of the beauties. I've long been able to hire a lot of people in my various jobs, and I've hired a lot of Columbia students. I've worked with a lot of Columbia students, and I really can speak to the skill set, and that depth of knowledge makes a difference.
Yeah, I think so too, and more and more, because what used to be, it used to be that the only way you could find out the sort of basic facts of what was happening in the world was by being a customer of a news organization. Well, that's not true anymore. So you really have to think in journalism, how do we add value beyond just the basic kind of, newswire ticker stuff, which everybody just absorbs from being in front of a screen all day. And that's where the kind of depth and substantive knowledge and writing skill that we teach, I think, is a great credential to take into the market.
I think probably one of the last things we wanted to address here, people always wonder, well, which program should I apply for? And there's a lot of ways to think about that, right? You might have some expertise already in a particular area, already be a political reporter or already be a business reporter, and recognize what you don't know and say, I really would love to have time to do a long thesis in this area and to develop some of my skills there. Or perhaps you're already a political reporter and you want to be a better one and think, maybe if I were to understand better economics and business, I could really do something there. So there's a lot of different ways to think about it. What do you tell people, Nick?
We're a small boutique school, and we're a small boutique program, and we do this in a very retail way. All of us during admission season and acceptance season have long phone calls with individuals, accepted students, to talk about this very thing. So, it really depends on the luck of the draw, what kind of work you want to do. I do think there's a couple of specific things that go on in the business concentration. You're required to learn a sort of core curriculum outside the course you teach.
Yes.
That's very you know, economically useful to you economic knowledge to get a employment and be able to practice business journalism specifically. So that's one thing to consider is do you want that experience of taking, you know, finance and accounting courses, or do you want to be more sort of free-ranging? And again, you know, we're a small program. There's 4 majors. The students hang out together a lot between the 4 majors. The faculty members do too. So you know, we can get creative and flexible with people who want to be cross-disciplinary.
Right. So I think we'll probably just wrap it up and say we can't wait to hear from everybody, right? We're looking forward to what we can do for
and
you.
We're available on email, telephone, etc. if anybody wants to ask us questions or anything like that.